The doors of the arena hall slammed shut behind me before I even understood what I had just agreed to. Every eye in the massive chamber turned toward me. Hundreds of alien delegates, traders, and diplomats from a dozen different worlds stopped talking at once. The silence pressed down on me like a physical weight. Somewhere above, a Corvette war drum stopped mid-beat, as if even the musicians could not believe what they had just seen. I had stepped forward. Threxa Val, champion of the Corvette Dominion, stood on the raised stone platform at the center of the hall, her arms crossed. Her golden eyes locked on me with something between amusement and disbelief. She was tall, taller than any human I had ever met, with dark violet skin marked by silver ritual scars that told the story of 40 victories. 40 suitors, from a dozen species, had challenged her. 40 had failed. And she had just repeated her old, mocking promise to the crowd, the one that had become a running joke across half the galaxy. "I will marry any human who can defeat me," she had said, smirking, clearly expecting no one from my species to be foolish enough to try. Then I had walked out from the crowd of dock workers and cargo handlers near the back wall, past startled diplomats, past a compact ambassador who looked like he wanted to grab my arm and drag me back. I had not planned this. Or maybe, somewhere quiet in the back of my mind, I had been planning it for weeks without admitting it to myself. "You," Threxa said, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "a cargo worker." "My name is Ethan Cross," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I accept your challenge." A ripple of laughter broke out from the Corvith delegation. One of their officers, a broad warrior named Draxel, laughed so hard he had to steady himself against a pillar. Even some of the human traders behind me groaned, embarrassed on behalf of our entire species. I understood why. Humanity was new here. We had only been part of the wider galactic community for 6 years. Most species still saw us as fragile, disorganized, barely worth noticing. We had no war fleets to speak of, no ancient empires, no champions like Threxa who had spent decades training for ritual combat. To them, a human stepping into that arena was like a child challenging a mountain. Threxa studied me for a long moment, and something shifted behind her golden eyes. Not respect, not yet. Just curiosity, the way a predator studies something unusual before deciding whether it is worth its attention. "Do you understand what you are agreeing to?" she asked. "This is not a game. This is not a show. If you lose everything you brought into this hall, and you leave with nothing but your life, if you are lucky." "I understand," I said. "And if you win," she continued, her smirk returning, sharper this time, "you win me. Forever. Bound by Dominion law, witnessed by every delegation in this hall. Are you prepared for that as well?" I did not answer right away. The truth was more complicated than anything I could say out loud in front of that crowd. I was not standing here because I wanted to marry an alien warrior I had never spoken to before today. I was standing here because 3 weeks ago, during a long night shift loading cargo containers, I had overheard 2 Corvith officers discussing the exact wording of their ritual combat laws, laughing about how no outsider had ever bothered to read them carefully. I had read them, all of them. Every dusty clause, every archaic rule that no one used anymore because no one remembered why it existed. And I had found something. "I am prepared," I said instead, because the real answer would have to wait. Threxa tilted her head, studying me like a puzzle that refused to make sense. "You do not look like a warrior." "I'm not," I admitted. "I load cargo containers for a living." That earned more laughter, but this time it was different, lighter, almost sympathetic. A few of the other human traders behind me had gone pale. I recognized Daniel Hart, one of the senior compact representatives, pushing his way toward the front of the crowd, his expression a mixture of panic and disbelief. "Ethan," he hissed under his breath, close enough now that only I could hear him. "What are you doing? Do you have any idea what happens if you lose this? Every species in this hall will remember it. They will remember that a human stood up and got crushed in 30 seconds. Do you understand what that does to us? To every trade agreement we're trying to build?" I understood perfectly. That was exactly the problem I had been thinking about for weeks. Humanity had been polite and careful and quiet since we joined the wider galaxy, always trying not to offend anyone, always accepting the smaller seat at the table, the smaller share of the deal, the assumption that we were guests here rather than equals. I was tired of it. Not angry, exactly. Just tired. "I know what I'm doing," I told Daniel, though I was not entirely sure that was true. Threxa raised a hand, and the hall fell silent again. "The challenge is accepted," she announced. her voice ringing off the high stone ceiling. Ethan Cross of the Human Compact will face me in 3 days' time, under the old rules of the Dominion, witnessed by all present. 3 days. The moment those words left her mouth, the weight of what I had just done finally settled fully onto my shoulders. 3 days to prepare for a fight against someone who had never lost, who was stronger than me, faster than me, and who had spent her entire life training for exactly this kind of combat. 3 days was not enough time to become someone who could beat her in a fair fight. Which was fine, because I had never intended to fight her fairly. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring and whispering, already placing bets on how quickly this would end, Threxa stepped down from the platform and approached me directly. Up close, she was even more imposing, her presence radiating a kind of quiet confidence that came from 40 victories and 0 doubts. "Why did you step forward?" she asked, and for the first time, the mockery was gone from her voice. It was a genuine question. "You are not a warrior. You are not a fool, I think, though many would disagree. So why?" I looked up at her, at those golden eyes that had watched 40 opponents fall, and I told her the only part of the truth I was willing to share. "Because someone has to be the first," I said, "and it might as well be me." She studied me a moment longer, then something that might have been the beginning of respect flickered across her face before she turned and walked away, her silver-scarred arms swinging at her sides, utterly certain that in 3 days she would add a 41st scar to her collection. Daniel grabbed my arm the moment she was out of earshot. "Ethan, talk to me. What is going on with you?" I glanced around the emptying hall, at the curious stares still lingering from a few delegates who had not yet left, and I lowered my voice. "Not here," I said. "I'll explain everything, but not here." He did not look satisfied with that answer, but he nodded, and together we made our way out of the arena hall and into the corridors of the station, where the real explanation would have to wait until we were somewhere no one else could listen. Because what I had found in those old Dominion laws was not a way to win a fight. It was a way to make the fight itself meaningless. And in 3 days, the entire galaxy was going to watch me prove it. Outside, the station's viewport corridors stretched in long curved lines, showing the slow turn of stars beyond thick reinforced glass. I walked in silence for a while, my thoughts racing faster than my feet, replaying the moment I stepped forward, wondering if I had just made the smartest decision of my life, or the most reckless one. Daniel finally broke the silence once we reached a quiet observation deck, empty except for the 2 of us and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. "You're an engineer," he said slowly, as if working through a puzzle out loud. "A former military engineer. You don't have combat training." "Not real combat training, not the kind that matters against someone like her." "No," I agreed, "I don't." "Then explain it to me. Because right now, from where I'm standing, it looks like you just volunteered to get seriously hurt in front of every species in this sector, and take the rest of us down with you." I turned to face him, and for the first time since stepping forward in that hall, I let myself smile, just slightly. "I'm not planning to win by fighting her," I said. "I'm planning to win by outthinking her. There's a difference. And if I'm right about what I found in their old laws, it won't even matter how strong she is." Daniel stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him deciding whether to believe me or whether to try to talk me out of this entirely. In the end, he did neither. He just sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and asked the only question that mattered. "What did you find?" I looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, at the vast, quiet dark that held 1,000 different species, who all assumed they understood exactly what humanity was, and exactly how little we mattered. "Something they forgot about their own rules," I said. "Something no one has used in centuries, because no one ever needed to. Give me 3 days, Daniel. I'll show you exactly what I mean." He did not look convinced, but he nodded anyway, because at that point, there was nothing else either of us could do. The challenge had been made. The witnesses had seen it. In 3 days I would stand across from Threxaval in front of the entire galactic community, and one way or another, the outcome would change how every species in that hall looked at humanity from that moment forward. I just had to make sure it changed in the right direction. 3 years before I ever set foot in that arena hall, I had a different name attached to me. Not a different word exactly, but a different weight. Back then, people called me Lieutenant Cross, and I wore a uniform that meant something in rooms where decisions got made about who lived and who did not. I do not talk about those years much, not because they are a secret exactly, but because the people who need to know already do, and the people who do not know would only ask questions I am tired of answering. I was an engineer attached to a rapid response unit, the kind of unit that gets sent somewhere when everything has already gone wrong and someone needs to figure out how to make the wrong thing survivable. I built things. I found weaknesses in systems, in structures, in plans that looked solid until you looked closely enough to see the cracks. I also learned in those years that the person who wins a fight is rarely the strongest person in the room. It is almost always the person who understood the situation better than everyone else standing in it. I left that life behind quietly, the way most people do when they decide they have had enough of it. I did not talk about why. I took a job loading cargo containers on a neutral trade station because it was simple and steady, and it asked nothing of me except my hands and my back. For 2 years, that was enough. I liked the simplicity of it. I liked not being responsible for anything more complicated than making sure a container reached the right dock. Then, 3 weeks before the day I stepped forward in that hall, I overheard 2 Corvette officers talking during a night shift, and the quiet life I had built for myself started to feel very small. The officers did not know I was listening. Why would they? To them, I was just another human laborer, invisible in the way background things become invisible when you see them every day. They were talking about Threxa Vol, about her latest victory over some unfortunate suitor from a species I had never heard of, and one of them laughed about how easy the old laws made everything. "No one ever reads the actual text," the older officer said, his voice carrying easily across the empty loading dock. "They see combat and defeat, and they assume it means what it sounds like it means. They never bother checking the archive language. Why would they? It has not mattered in 600 years." I remember standing very still behind a stack of containers, my hands full of cargo manifests, listening to 2 aliens casually discuss a set of laws that had decided the fate of 40 different people who had stepped into that arena and lost. Something about the way he said it, so dismissive, so certain that no one would ever bother to check, lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. That night, after my shift ended, I did not go back to my quarters. I went to the station's public archive terminal instead, and I started reading. It took me 4 nights to get through all of it. The Dominion's ritual combat laws were ancient, written in a formal dialect that had fallen out of common use centuries ago, full of legal phrasing that most modern Corvette citizens had never bothered to study, because the modern interpretation of the rules had simply become the accepted one. Everyone assumed defeat meant submission, or incapacitation, or in the more brutal old traditions, something worse. Everyone assumed the fight ended when one side could no longer continue. But that is not what the original text said. Buried in a section that had not been formally invoked in over 600 years, the ancient law defined defeat differently. It defined it as a matter of ground. In the old tradition, before Corvette combat became a display of raw strength, warriors fought across a marked arena floor, and defeat was measured by control of territory, not by injury. A challenger who could force the champion to yield their position 3 separate times, regardless of the physical outcome of any single exchange, was considered to have defeated them under the old law. It did not matter who struck harder. It did not matter who bled. It mattered who held the ground when the ritual ended. No one used this version of the rule anymore, because no one needed to. Champions like Threxa were so overwhelmingly stronger than their challengers that the fights never lasted long enough for anyone to think about ground control. The modern interpretation had become the only interpretation, not because the old law had been erased, but because no one had ever survived long enough to make it relevant again. I read that section of the archive 4 times before I let myself believe what I was looking at. It was not a loophole in the sense of a technicality that broke the spirit of the law. It was the actual, original law, preserved exactly as it had been written, simply forgotten, because it required something modern challengers never had: patience, and the discipline to survive long enough to use it. I did not decide immediately to challenge Threxa myself. That thought came slowly, over the following days, as I kept turning the discovery over in my mind, wondering what I was supposed to do with it. I could have reported it to the Compact ambassadors, let them decide what to do with the information. But I already knew how that would go. They would debate it for months, consult legal experts, worry about offending the Dominion, and eventually the moment would pass, the way important moments so often do when they get handed to committees instead of people willing to act. So I made a different choice. I decided that if anyone was going to test this old law, it should be someone who understood exactly what they were doing, someone who could survive the physical punishment long enough to make the ground control law relevant again. Not because I wanted glory, not because I particularly wanted to marry an alien warrior I had never met. Because I wanted to prove something simple. I wanted every species in that arena hall to understand that humanity did not need to be the strongest people in the room to win. We only needed to be the ones who understood the room better than anyone else standing in it. After I explained all of this to Daniel on the observation deck, he sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the stars, processing everything I had just told him. "You're certain about the translation," he finally said. "Absolutely certain. Because if you're wrong about this, Ethan, there is no version of this where you get a second chance to check." "I'm certain," I said. "I had 3 different translation systems cross-check the archive text. I even found a secondary reference in an older Dominion legal commentary that confirms the same interpretation. The modern rule is a convention, not law. The actual law was never repealed. It was just forgotten. And she doesn't know this. I doubt anyone alive remembers it," I said. "Least of all Threxa. Why would she? She's never needed to think past the first 30 seconds of any fight she's been in." Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his face. "So your plan is to survive, not to fight her the way she expects, not to try to overpower her, just to survive long enough to force her to yield ground 3 times. "That's the plan," I confirmed. "Do you have any idea how difficult that will be? She is a trained warrior, Ethan. She has fought 40 opponents and walked away from every single one of them without a scratch that mattered. You are an engineer who has not thrown a real strike in years." He was right to worry, and I did not try to pretend otherwise. The 3 days ahead of me were not going to be spent building strength I did not have time to build, or speed I could never match. They were going to be spent doing the only thing I actually had a chance of doing well, preparing my mind, my endurance, and my understanding of exactly how she fought. I spent that first night reviewing every recording I could find of Threxa's previous 40 matches. The station archives had partial footage of most of them, grainy recordings taken by spectators over the years, but enough to study. I watched them over and over, not looking for weaknesses in her technique, because I did not believe she had any that mattered against someone at my level. I was looking for patterns, rhythms. The way she moved when she was certain of victory, the way her stance shifted when an opponent tried something unexpected, the small tells that might tell me when she was about to commit fully to an attack. What I found, watching hours of footage late into that first night, was something I had not expected. Threxa did not fight cautiously. She never needed to. Every one of her 40 opponents had come at her the same way, trying to match her strength or speed, trying to win through direct confrontation. And every single time, she had ended the fight within the first minute, because there was no reason for her to hold back against someone trying to fight her on her own terms. She had never once faced an opponent who refused to engage her directly. She had never faced someone whose entire strategy was built around not being where she expected them to be, around making her chase, around forcing her to spend energy and patience she had never needed to spend before. That was my opening, not strength, not speed, patience, and the willingness to make an entire fight about something other than the fight itself. The second day, I trained my body as much as 3 days allowed, focused entirely on endurance and movement rather than power. I found an old training space near the station's lower decks, mostly used by cargo crews for stretching between shifts, and I spent hours running drills meant to build stamina, working on footwork, on the kind of controlled breathing that lets a person keep moving long after exhaustion should have stopped them. I was not trying to become someone who could match Threxa's strength. I was trying to become someone who could survive being near it for far longer than anyone expected. Word had gotten around the station by then. Other human traders and workers had heard about the challenge, and opinions were sharply divided. Some thought I was brave. Most thought I was making a serious mistake that would embarrass everyone who called themselves part of the human compact. I heard the whispers when I walked through the corridors, saw the sideways glances, felt the weight of an entire species' reputation settling onto my shoulders whether I wanted it there or not. Daniel stayed close during those 2 days, watching my preparation with a mixture of concern and grudging curiosity. On the second night, as I finished a long set of endurance drills, he sat down across from me, looking more thoughtful than worried, for the first time since the challenge had been made. "If this works," he said slowly, "if you actually manage to force her to yield ground 3 times, what happens then? You win the challenge. You win her, according to their law. Is that actually what you want?" I sat down beside him, catching my breath, thinking carefully before I answered. "No," I admitted, "that's not what I want at all. I have something else in mind. But I can't do anything about that part until after the fight is over. Right now, the only thing that matters is proving the old law still applies. Everything after that depends on what happens in that arena." Daniel studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. the concern giving way slowly to something closer to trust. "Then I hope you're as right about this as you think you are," he said. "Because tomorrow, the entire hall is going to be watching to see if you were brave or just foolish." I did not sleep much that final night before the fight. I lay awake going over the old law again and again in my mind, checking every detail, every translation, every possible way Threxa or the Dominion officials might dispute what I planned to invoke. I thought about the 40 scars on her arms, the 40 opponents who had come before me and lost within a minute, never imagining that the fight could be about anything other than strength. I was not stronger than Threxa Vol. I never would be. But I understood something about that arena that she did not, and in 3 days, I was going to find out whether understanding was enough. The arena hall looked different when it was full. 3 days earlier, it had been a wide stone chamber with a raised platform at its center, mostly empty except for the delegates who happened to be passing through. Now, every seat in the tiered gallery above was filled, and the crowd spilled out into the standing sections along the walls. Dozens of species had gathered, drawn by word of the challenge that had spread across the station and beyond it, carried by traders and travelers eager to see whether a human could possibly survive against Threxa Vol. I stood at the edge of the marked stone floor, wearing simple training gear rather than any kind of armor, because armor was not permitted under the old rules and I had no intention of asking for exceptions that might draw attention to how carefully I had studied those rules. Daniel stood nearby, along with a small cluster of other human representatives who had come to watch, their faces tight with the particular kind of worry that comes from caring about someone whose choices you cannot control. Across the circle, Threxa waited, calm and certain, her silver-scarred arms loose at her sides. She wore the same simple combat wraps she always wore, nothing elaborate, because she had never needed anything more than her own strength and speed to end a fight quickly. When our eyes met across the marked floor, she offered me the smallest nod, not quite respect, but not quite the mockery from 3 days earlier either. An official from the Dominion stepped onto the platform between us, an older Corveth male whose formal robes marked him as a keeper of ritual law. He raised both hands, and the enormous hall gradually fell silent, hundreds of different species holding their breath at once. "The challenge stands," the official announced, his voice amplified to carry through the entire chamber. "Ethan Cross of the Human Compact has invoked the right of challenge against Threxa Vol, champion of the Corveth Dominion. Under the old and binding law of this hall, the combat shall proceed until defeat is achieved by either party." He did not specify what defeat meant. Of course he did not. No one in that hall, aside from me, had any reason to think it meant anything other than the modern interpretation everyone had grown up assuming was the only one. "Combatants," the official said, stepping back toward the edge of the platform. "Take your positions." I walked to the marked starting point on my side of the circle, feeling the weight of every eye in that hall settle onto me at once. My heart was pounding, my hands were steady only because I had spent hours the night before forcing myself to breathe slowly, over and over, until the shaking stopped. Across from me, Threxa settled into a low, ready stance, the kind of stance that came from decades of instinct rather than conscious thought. "Last chance to withdraw," she said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear across the circle. There was no mockery in her voice now, just something that almost sounded like concern. "I have no wish to seriously harm you, human, but I will not hold back simply because you are unprepared." "I'm not withdrawing," I said. She studied me for one more moment, then something settled in her expression. A kind of resigned acceptance that the fight was about to happen whether she liked the terms or not. "Then let us begin," she said. The official raised a hand, held it there for a breath that felt impossibly long, and then dropped it. Threxa moved immediately, faster than I had expected even after hours of watching her recordings. She crossed half the circle in a single stride, her arm sweeping toward me in a controlled strike meant to end things quickly. The same opening move she had used against nearly all of her previous 40 opponents. I was already moving before her strike landed, not backward, not into a defensive crouch the way every one of her past opponents had, but sideways, angling my body along the edge of the marked floor rather than meeting her attack directly. Her strike passed through the space where I had been standing a half-second earlier, and for the first time in the fight, I saw something flicker across her face that I had not expected to see so early. Surprise. I did not stay to see how she processed it. I kept moving, circling along the outer edge of the stone floor, forcing her to turn to track me rather than letting her set the pace of the exchange. She recovered quickly, pivoting to follow, but the small delay had already cost her the momentum of her opening strike, and I could see her recalculating, adjusting to an opponent who was not simply standing still waiting to be struck. The next several exchanges followed a similar pattern. She would close the distance, moving with a speed and precision that made it clear how badly outmatched I was in any direct confrontation, and I would refuse to meet her head-on, sliding sideways, using the width of the marked circle to keep her turning, keep her adjusting, keep her spending effort she had never needed to spend against any previous challenger. It was not painless. Twice in those early exchanges, her strikes caught the edge of my guard, glancing blows that still carried enough force to send jolts of pain through my arm and shoulder, staggering me for half a second before I managed to keep moving. The crowd gasped each time, certain that the end was coming, that I would go down the way every human watcher secretly feared I would. But I did not go down. I stumbled, caught myself, kept circling. By the third minute, something in the rhythm of the fight had begun to shift, and I could see it registering on Threxa's face even through her focus. She was breathing harder than she should have been this early in any of her previous matches. Her strikes, though still faster and stronger than anything I could match, were beginning to carry the smallest trace of frustration, small adjustments in timing that told me she was no longer entirely certain how to end this quickly. I kept my strategy simple, the same plan I had rehearsed over and over in my mind during those 3 days of preparation. I was not trying to win exchanges. I was trying to control positioning, using the marked boundaries of the circle itself as a tool, forcing Threxa to choose between pursuing me toward the edges of the ritual space or breaking off her attacks to reset her position. Every time she chose to break off rather than risk stepping outside the marked boundary, I saw the same flicker of frustration cross her expression. A warrior used to ending things quickly finding herself, for the first time in 40 fights, forced to think several steps ahead instead of simply overwhelming an opponent in the first exchange. Around the 5th minute, the crowd's mood in the gallery had shifted from certainty to confusion. Whispers spread through the tiered seating, delegates leaning toward each other, clearly trying to understand why the fight had not already ended the way every previous challenge had ended. I could hear fragments of conversation carried down from the gallery, voices asking why the human was still standing, why Threxa had not simply closed the distance and finished things the way she always had before. She tried, more than once, to force a direct confrontation, closing the distance suddenly, using bursts of speed clearly meant to trap me before I could slide away again. Each time, I forced myself to read her weight shift in the half-second before she committed, using every hour of footage I had studied to anticipate the angle of her approach, and each time I managed to slip past the worst of it, taking glancing damage rather than a direct hit, continuing to move rather than allowing myself to be pinned against the boundary. By the 8th minute, my body was beginning to feel the accumulated weight of those glancing strikes. My left arm throbbed where an early hit had landed harder than I wanted to admit, and my legs burned from the constant lateral movement I had been forcing them through since the fight began. I could feel exhaustion creeping into the edges of my focus, the kind of fatigue that makes a person's reactions slow just enough to matter. But I could see the same exhaustion beginning to show in Threxa. Her breathing had grown heavier, her strikes slightly less precise than they had been in the opening minutes, and for the first time since the fight began, I saw genuine uncertainty in her golden eyes as she circled toward me once more. "You are not fighting the way the others fought," she said between breaths, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear. "I know," I said. She came at me again, faster this time, clearly deciding to commit fully, rather than allow the strange rhythm of the fight to continue any longer. I read the shift in her stance a half-second before she moved, and instead of sliding away entirely, I stepped into the edge of her attack at an angle, letting her own momentum carry her slightly past the position she wanted, using the small opening to push against her extended arm and redirect her forward motion toward the boundary line marked into the stone floor. She caught herself before crossing it, planting her feet hard, her whole body twisting to stop her own momentum from carrying her across the line that would have counted as the first yield of ground under the old law. But she had to yield. She had to step back, resetting her position, breaking off the attack entirely to avoid crossing the boundary. I saw the exact moment it registered in her expression, a flicker of confusion mixed with something that looked almost like respect, though she clearly had no idea yet what that small retreat actually meant under the ancient rules neither she nor anyone else in that hall remembered. 1. I did not celebrate. I did not let my expression change at all, because the last thing I needed was for anyone, especially the Dominion official watching from the edge of the platform, to start wondering exactly what I was tracking so carefully in the middle of the fight. I simply reset my stance and kept moving, kept circling, kept forcing the pace of the fight to remain on my terms rather than hers. The crowd's confusion had grown into something closer to fascination by then. I could hear Daniel's voice somewhere in the gallery, along with the other human representatives, their tone shifting from worry to something that sounded almost like disbelief, watching a fight that should have ended in the first 30-second stretch on past 10 minutes with no clear end in sight. Threxa came at me twice more in quick succession, her frustration clearly building, each attack faster and more committed than the last. I managed to avoid the worst of the first exchange, though a glancing strike caught my ribs hard enough to steal the breath from my lungs and send me stumbling toward the boundary line myself. For a terrifying half-second, I thought I might cross it, thought the entire strategy might collapse because of a single mistimed step. I caught myself just short of the line, planting my foot hard against the stone floor, forcing my body to twist back into the circle rather than out of it. The crowd gasped again, certain this time that the end had finally come. It had not. I straightened, ignoring the sharp pain along my side, and forced myself back into position, circling once more, refusing to give Threxa the satisfaction of seeing how close that exchange had come to ending everything. Her second attack came moments later, faster still, and this time I used everything I had studied about her rhythm, about the small tell in her shoulder that preceded her most committed strikes, to time my movement precisely. I did not try to avoid the attack entirely this time. I let her come, then shifted at the last possible moment, using her own forward momentum against her the same way I had the first time, redirecting her extended reach toward the boundary line with everything my exhausted arms had left to give. This time, she could not stop herself in time. Her foot crossed the marked line by the smallest possible margin before she caught her balance and pulled back, but it was enough. The Dominion official on the platform's edge, watching closely for exactly this kind of moment, called out something in the formal Corvith ritual dialect, his voice carrying a note of surprise that told me even he had not expected to need those particular words today. 2. Threxa froze for a moment, staring at the boundary line beneath her feet, then looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on her face at any point since the challenge began. Not frustration, not confusion. Understanding. "You are not trying to defeat me the way the others tried," she said slowly, her voice quiet enough that it barely carried across the space between us. "You are trying to make me yield ground." I did not answer. There was nothing left to say that would not give away exactly how much more of this she needed to survive. She straightened slowly, her breathing still heavy, sweat visible along her brow for the first time in the entire fight, and something settled over her expression that I had not expected. Not anger, determination. "Then let us see how well you understand what you have started," she said, and came at me one final time, faster and more controlled than any attack before it, clearly no longer treating this as a formality to be finished quickly, but as a real fight against an opponent she finally understood she could not simply overpower. The crowd had gone completely silent, hundreds of beings from a dozen different worlds leaning forward at once, watching a fight that had already broken every expectation anyone in that hall had walked in with. I had one more yield of ground to force, and I was almost out of strength to force it with. Threxa's final approach was nothing like the ones before it. Gone was the casual confidence of someone who had never needed a second strategy. In its place was the focused intensity of a warrior who had finally recognized a real threat, even if she still did not fully understand what that threat actually was. She closed the distance carefully this time, no longer relying purely on speed, but combining it with controlled feints designed to draw out my reaction before committing to a real strike. I recognized the pattern from her recordings, a technique she had used exactly once, years earlier, against an opponent who had briefly given her more trouble than the rest. My legs felt heavy beneath me, my ribs ached with every breath, and the accumulated fatigue of nearly 15 minutes of constant movement was beginning to blur the edges of my focus in ways I could not afford. I forced myself to keep my breathing steady, the way I had trained myself to do years earlier in a very different kind of chaos, and I watched her shoulders instead of her hands, the way I had learned watching hours of old footage. Her feint came, a quick shift toward my left that was designed to make me commit my defense in the wrong direction. I did not take the bait, holding my position a half-second longer than instinct wanted me to, and when her real strike followed a heartbeat later, aimed low and fast toward my side, I was already turning into it rather than away. The impact still landed, hard enough to drive the air from my lungs and send a wave of pain through muscles already stretched past their limit, but I did not go down. I let the force of the strike carry me sideways rather than backward, using her own momentum the same way I had twice before, angling my body so that her extended arm swept past me toward the boundary rather than through me. She realized what was happening a fraction of a second too late. Her balance, already strained from the force of a strike that had not landed the way she intended, tipped forward past the point where she could easily recover. I saw the exact moment her instincts took over, her whole body twisting hard to try to catch herself before crossing the line, muscles straining with an effort that would have looked effortless against any of her previous 40 opponents. It was not enough. Her leading foot crossed the boundary by a margin so small that half the hall likely missed it entirely, but the Dominion official standing at the platform's edge did not miss it. His eyes had been fixed precisely on that line since the second yield, and the moment her foot touched stone beyond the marked boundary, his voice rang out through the silent hall in the same formal ritual dialect as before, this time carrying a weight that seemed to still the very air in the chamber. 3. For a long moment, nobody moved. The entire arena hall sat frozen in a silence so complete that I could hear my own ragged breathing echoing off the stone walls. Threxa stood exactly where she had stopped herself, one foot planted just beyond the boundary line, staring down at it as though the marking on the floor had personally betrayed her. Then the Dominion official spoke again, his voice carrying the formal weight of centuries of law that had not been invoked in 600 years. By the old and binding right of ground, he announced, each word deliberate, 3 yields have been recorded against the champion. Under the ancient law of this hall, defeat has been achieved. The silence broke all at once into a roar of confused voices, hundreds of beings from a dozen different species erupting into argument and disbelief simultaneously. I could hear delegates shouting questions up toward the platform, demanding explanations, some insisting there had to be some mistake, others already pulling up archive records on personal devices to verify what they had just heard. Threxa did not join the chaos. She stood very still, staring at me across the marked stone floor, her chest still heaving from exertion, sweat glistening along her violet skin, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something that looked almost like admiration fighting its way through the shock. Ground, she said quietly, though somehow her voice carried clearly even through the noise filling the hall. You were counting ground the entire time. Yes, I admitted, my own voice rough with exhaustion. That law has not been used in centuries, she said, and for the first time since I had met her, genuine confusion colored her voice, not anger, not humiliation, just the stunned realization of someone confronting something she had never imagined possible. I did not even know it still existed. Neither did anyone else, I said. That was rather the point. The Dominion official raised his hands again, trying to restore order to the chamber, but it took several long minutes before the noise settled enough for him to be heard clearly. When it finally did, his voice carried the same formal weight it had carried when announcing my acceptance 3 days earlier. The old law is clear, he said, addressing the entire hall now rather than just the 2 of us. Regardless of modern convention, the original text of Dominion ritual combat law has never been formally repealed. Defeat by yield of ground, 3 times recorded before witnesses, stands as valid under ancient right. The challenge belongs to Ethan Cross of the Human Compact. More shouting followed, delegates from a dozen different species arguing amongst themselves, some outraged, some fascinated, a few already laughing at the sheer audacity of what had just happened in front of them. I caught sight of Daniel in the gallery, standing perfectly still, his mouth slightly open, looking as though he could not quite believe what he had just watched unfold. Threxa crossed the remaining distance between us slowly, each step deliberate, and stopped just before the center marking of the circle, close enough now that I could see the full extent of her exhaustion, the same fatigue I felt reflected clearly in her posture despite her far greater strength and endurance. I do not know whether to be furious with you, she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that it did not carry beyond the 2 of us, or genuinely impressed. I have fought 40 opponents, human. Every one of them tried to match my strength. You did not try to match anything, you simply refused to fight the fight I expected. That was the only chance I had, I said honestly. I could never beat you the way the others tried, so I didn't try that way. She studied me for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her golden eyes, before her gaze dropped briefly to the boundary line at her feet, the same line that had just ended 40 consecutive victories in the space of a single ancient technicality no one alive had thought to remember. You humiliated me, she said, though there was less anger in the words than I expected. In front of every delegation in this sector, do you understand what this will mean for me? For the Dominion? I understand it will mean something, I said carefully. I'm not entirely sure yet what. Neither am I, she admitted, and for just a moment, the fierce warrior who had never lost looked almost uncertain, almost young, standing there in the aftermath of the only defeat she had ever known. The Dominion official approached us then, flanked by two other formally dressed Corvette officials, who had clearly been summoned the moment word of the outcome reached them. Their expressions were unreadable, though the tension in their posture suggested this was not a situation any of them had ever expected to manage. The binding terms of the ancient law require formal acknowledgement before all present, the official said, addressing Threxa directly. You are bound by your own declared oath, spoken freely before witnesses 3 days ago. The challenger has met the conditions of victory under law, never formally repealed. You understand what this requires of you. Threxa's jaw tightened, but she did not argue. Whatever else she was, whatever pride had been wounded by an opponent she had never respected until the last few minutes of a fight she should have won in the first 30 seconds, she was clearly someone who honored her own word once it had been given in front of witnesses. I understand, she said, her voice steady despite everything. The official turned to me next, his expression carefully neutral. Ethan Cross, you have defeated the champion of the Corvette Dominion, under binding ancient law. The terms of the challenge, as declared before this hall, entitle you to claim what was offered. Do you claim it? Every eye in that vast hall turned toward me at once, hundreds of beings from a dozen worlds waiting to hear what I would say next. Threxa stood very still, watching me with an expression I could not quite read, bracing herself for whatever answer I was about to give. I had spent 3 days preparing my body and my strategy for this fight. But I had also spent those same 3 days thinking carefully about this exact moment, about what I actually wanted from all of this. Because winning had never been the true goal. Proving something had been the goal. And the way I answered this question was going to matter just as much as the fight itself. Before I answer, I said, my voice carrying as steadily as I could manage through the exhaustion still weighing down every muscle in my body, I would like to make a different proposal, one that I believe serves everyone in this hall better than the original terms of the challenge ever could. Threxa's eyes narrowed slightly, curiosity replacing the tension that had been building in her expression. Speak, the Dominion official said, though his tone carried clear wariness at the idea of further complications to a situation already unprecedented in 600 years. I took a breath, steadying myself, and looked out at the sea of faces watching from the gallery above, at Daniel standing frozen among the human delegation, at Threxa standing close enough that I could see every line of exhaustion and uncertainty on her face. I did not step forward 3 days ago because I wanted to marry a warrior I had never met, I said, loud enough now for the entire hall to hear clearly. I stepped forward because I wanted every species in this sector to understand something about my people. We are new here, we are smaller, weaker in many of the ways that matter to most of you. But we are not foolish, and we are not going to spend the next century accepting whatever small place at the table everyone assumes we deserve. The hall had gone quiet again, hundreds of beings listening intently now, sensing that something larger than a single fight was unfolding in front of them. What I am asking for, I continued, is not a marriage bound by an old law neither of us fully understood 3 days ago. What I am asking for is a formal renegotiation of trade and diplomatic terms between the Corvette Dominion and the Human Compact, witnessed and binding, using this victory as the foundation for equal standing between our peoples going forward. Threxa stared at me, and for the first time since the fight ended, something that looked almost like genuine respect broke through the complicated mixture of emotions on her face. You would give up your claim, she said slowly, for a trade agreement. I would give up a claim I never truly wanted, I corrected gently, for something that actually matters. To my people, and I suspect, in time, to yours as well. The Dominion official exchanged a long look with his companions, clearly caught off guard by a request that fell entirely outside anything the ancient law had ever anticipated. But the murmurs spreading through the gallery were not murmurs of outrage, they were murmurs of something closer to fascination, delegates from a dozen worlds recalculating everything they thought they understood about the small, quiet species that had just rewritten the terms of an ancient tradition in front of all of them. Threxa was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression that had shifted entirely from where it had started 3 days earlier, from mockery and dismissal, to something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine curiosity about exactly what kind of person had just chosen this path over the one everyone expected him to take. Very well, she finally said, turning to address the Dominion officials directly. I will honor whatever terms my oath requires, but I will personally oversee whatever negotiation follows. This human has earned that much respect from me, if nothing else. The hall erupted into noise once more, a mixture of shock and fascination and disbelief rippling through every delegation present, and somewhere in the middle of it all, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything that had just happened, the exhaustion, the relief, and the quiet certainty that the galaxy's understanding of humanity had just shifted in a way that could not easily be undone. The days following the fight passed in a blur of meetings, medical treatment, and a level of attention I had never experienced in my life and had no particular desire to get used to. The station's small medical bay treated the worst of the damage, a cracked rib, deep bruising along my left arm, and enough general strain that the attending physician gave me a long, disapproving look before informing me that I would need at least a week of rest before doing anything remotely strenuous again. I did not get a full week. There was too much happening for that. Word of the fight had spread far beyond the station within hours, carried by traders and travelers eager to share the story of the human who had defeated an undefeated Corveth champion, using a law no one had invoked in 600 years. By the time I was released from the medical bay, the story had already reached other systems, other stations, other species who had never given much thought to humanity before and were now, apparently, giving it a great deal of thought. Daniel found me on the same observation deck where we had first talked 3 days before everything happened, still healing, still moving carefully, watching the same slow turn of stars beyond the reinforced glass. "You should have told me the full plan," he said, though there was no real anger in it, just the lingering disbelief of someone who had watched an impossible thing happen right in front of him. The trade proposal. I would have prepared something at least. Instead, I stood there with the rest of the delegation looking like we had no idea what was happening. "You didn't have any idea what was happening," I pointed out. "Neither did I, not entirely. I knew what I wanted to ask for. I didn't know if she would actually agree to oversee it herself." "She did more than agree," Daniel said, settling into the seat beside me. "The formal negotiations start in 2 weeks. She specifically requested you be present for them, not as a formality, as an active participant. That surprised me, though perhaps it should not have." Over the following days, as the initial shock of the fight settled into something more permanent, Threxa and I had spoken several times, brief conversations at first, careful and formal, gradually becoming something closer to genuine exchange. She had not forgiven the humiliation easily. 40 victories, undone in a single afternoon by an opponent she had dismissed at first glance, was not something anyone processed quickly, regardless of species. But she had also, gradually, begun to see something in what I had done that went beyond simple humiliation. During one of our conversations, sitting in a quiet corner of the station's trade concourse while I was still recovering, she had admitted something that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. "In 40 fights," she said, turning a small data tablet over in her hands, not quite looking at me. "No one ever surprised me. Not truly. They came at me with strength, with speed, with everything their bodies could offer, and I answered it with more of the same, and it was always enough. I had begun to believe that was simply what combat was. Strength answering strength. And now?" I asked. "Now I understand that I only ever fought the kind of opponent who thought the way I did," she said. "You did not. You looked at the entire structure of the fight, the rules beneath the rules, and you found something the rest of us had stopped seeing centuries ago. That is not a small thing, Ethan Cross. That is a different way of thinking entirely, and I suspect it explains a great deal about why your species has managed to survive as long as it has, despite being smaller and weaker than nearly everyone else you have encountered." I did not have a good response to that, so I simply nodded, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people who had started as opponents and were slowly, awkwardly, becoming something else neither of us had a clear word for yet. The formal negotiations, when they finally began 2 weeks later, were unlike anything the compact delegation had experienced before. Threxa insisted on being present for every session, and her presence changed the tone of the discussions entirely. Where previous meetings between human representatives and Dominion officials had always carried an unspoken assumption of Corveth superiority, this time the Dominion officials treated the human delegation with a wariness that bordered on genuine respect, uncertain how to categorize a species capable of the kind of strategic thinking that had just ended an undefeated champion's 40-fight streak, using nothing but patience and careful legal analysis. I sat in on most of the sessions, not as a formal negotiator, since that was never my role or my expertise, but as an advisor whenever questions arose about the specifics of what had happened in the arena. It was strange, sitting in rooms full of experienced diplomats, watching them reference the fight, my fight, as a turning point in how an entire sector of the galaxy understood humanity's place among them. The terms that eventually emerged from those negotiations were not perfect. No treaty between two very different species, built on the foundation of a single unusual event, was ever going to be perfect. but they were significantly better than anything the Compact had managed to secure in the 6 years since humanity first joined the wider galactic community. Trade terms shifted toward genuine equality rather than the smaller share humanity had always quietly accepted before. Diplomatic protocols were revised to reflect mutual respect rather than a one-sided hierarchy nobody had ever formally stated but everyone had quietly understood. And perhaps most importantly, other species watching from a distance began treating human delegations differently as well. Word of the arena fight having spread far enough that our reputation across the sector had shifted in ways that went well beyond the Dominion alone. Threxa remained a constant presence throughout those weeks, and gradually, the careful formality between us gave way to something more genuine. We talked often, not about politics or trade terms, but about smaller things, our different ways of understanding strength, our different histories, the strange path that had brought a former military engineer and an undefeated warrior together in circumstances neither of us could have predicted a month earlier. "You never truly wanted to marry me," she said one evening, several weeks after the fight, as we sat together on the same observation deck where I had first explained my plan to Daniel. "Be honest with me, Ethan. When you stepped forward that day, marriage was never truly part of your plan." "No," I admitted. "It wasn't. I'm sorry if that's difficult to hear." To my surprise, she laughed, a genuine sound that I had not heard from her before, warm and unguarded in a way that felt entirely different from the composed warrior I had faced across that stone circle. "Do not apologize," she said. "I find it far more interesting this way. Every one of my previous 40 opponents wanted exactly what the old boast promised. You wanted something far larger, and in the process you gave me something none of them ever did." "What's that?" "A reason to actually think about what I was doing," she said, "instead of simply doing what I had always done because it had always worked before." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, watching the slow turn of distant stars, two people from entirely different worlds who had somehow found their way to something neither of us had expected when this all began. The story of that fight followed me for a long time afterward, told and retold across a dozen systems, growing slightly larger and more dramatic with each retelling the way stories always do. I never much cared for the attention it brought, the strangers who recognized my name in trade concourses, the occasional request from other species asking whether humanity had other forgotten legal loopholes worth exploring. What mattered to me was simpler than any of that. Humanity had walked into that hall as a species most of the galaxy still saw as small, fragile, and easily dismissed. We walked out of it as something else entirely, not because we had proven ourselves the strongest, but because we had proven that strength was never the only thing that mattered, and that sometimes, the person willing to understand the rules more carefully than anyone else in the room was the one who ended up changing everything. I still load cargo sometimes, on quieter days when the diplomatic obligations ease enough to let me. It keeps me grounded in a way the meetings and negotiations never quite manage to. But every now and then, walking through the same corridors where I first overheard two Corvith officers laughing about a law they assumed no one would ever bother to read, I think about how close that discovery came to being forgotten entirely, how easily it could have stayed buried in an old archive for another 600 years. It did not stay buried. And because it did not, an entire sector of the galaxy learned something about humanity that we are still, even now, in the process of proving to everyone else out there who has not yet had the chance to see it for themselves. We do not need to be the strongest people in the room. We only need to understand it better than anyone else standing in it.